Due to our current political environment, bracing for chaos in anticipation of an outcome or a verdict of a trial is what the standard operating procedure is for anyone in an area that's affected by a highly politicized or highly incendiary court case. And that's exactly what's happening right now in the United States. And this moves us into a new territory that you or I never wanted to be in. But here we are either way. And we need to discuss why bracing for chaos is the new expectation, as well as what these implications are that this case brings with it, because they go much deeper than just the face value discussions we're hearing about right now. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper. We're talking about bracing for chaos and how it's the new expectation and the new standard operating procedure for anybody in an area that has a highly incendiary trial going on. And that's not how things are supposed to work in the United States of America. Right now in Kenosha, Wisconsin, businesses are boarding up their windows and preparing for what looks like a natural disaster, but in reality they're preparing for unrest. And they're concerned about what might happen if this court case doesn't go a certain way. And this is not how things are supposed to work here, okay? Governor Tony Evers already activated 500 troops from the National Guard and has them on standby outside of city limits to be ready to go at any notice based on what could occur because of one trial, because of one court case. This is where things get very difficult for both you and I. And if you're worried about how you're going to prepare for the way things are going, then hit the subscribe button below, because this future is uncertain, but we need to have these conversations in order to stay ahead of the curve as best as possible, okay? So, why do we need to be concerned about this, and why is this whole bracing for chaos situation even part of the deal at this point? Well, first off, if this outcome leads to unrest, we have entered a new era of political violence. What I mean by that is that this changes the narrative. The narrative so far, and in most cases, has been an anti-establishment narrative. That's where a lot of these riots that evolved from protests began. Protests against an establishment situation that people didn't agree with. It doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. What matters is that at its root, it was an anti-establishment movement, okay? So for example, in 1967, the Long Hot Summer was an anti-establishment grouping of protests and riots that were based on race-based oppression, okay, and police brutality. That's a very simplified way of talking about it, but that's basically what caused it, okay? In 1992, the LA riots were caused by police officers being acquitted of any crimes against Rodney King and the brutal beating that he received. So those riots that then ensued were because of an anti-establishment concept that was being put out there because the justice system did not do the job it was meant to do. And even in May of 2020, around the George Floyd protests, okay, and the riots that ensued thereafter, when George Floyd died in police custody, people still had a sentiment of anti-establishment situations that they were trying to purvey and trying to put out there, and that's why they were protesting, because the establishment failed once again related to the justice system. So that all has nothing to do with your personal opinion on what occurred in those scenarios. What it has to do with is that the root of those riots and the root of that unrest came from not trusting the establishment and not trusting the justice system any longer. And that's where those situations arose from. However, this is different, and this is why these implications are huge. A lot of people are talking about this case in regards to self-defense and individual self-defense and the right to self-defense, right? That's what everybody's mostly concerned with. But here's what you really need to understand, and here's what we've done to ourselves now at this point in time. We've changed our trajectory. We're in a different phase now of this country when it comes to the way the justice system operates, okay? We've gone from an anti-establishment scenario of protests and rioting based on what the establishment or the system or the government or the authority is doing to its people, and whether or not some of those people are being disproportionately oppressed, okay? But with this case specifically, with the concept that if it doesn't go a certain way, there will be unrest, with the concept that a lot of the same scenarios that have applied to the other events we just discussed will unfold because of the outcome of this case, we have moved from anti-establishment to anti-individual. And when you go into the individual situation from the establishment situation, you've then moved into the territory of the person versus the person. It's no longer the person versus the authority. It's no longer the people versus the government. It becomes people versus people, okay? The Rittenhouse case was use of force between civilians, okay? It didn't have anything to do with race. It didn't have anything to do with the police or anything along those lines. This was people and people, okay? Understand that. This is not me trying to say anything political. This is just facts. The people who were involved didn't have any of those monikers attached to them, okay? Now, this was not establishment injustice. This wasn't any of that. But the media and the mob mentality will affect the jury and the jurors regardless when it comes to how this whole case is going to be decided. And this whole system of justice we have has changed now because there no longer will be a fair trial. We can't have that any longer when these cases are politicized, when they are as incendiary as they become, and when the threat of violence and unrest is associated with these cases. There will no longer be a scenario where the Sixth Amendment protects your right to a fair trial. And this is really the implication you need to understand. Self-defense is huge, and of course we're concerned about the aspect of that in this argument. However, something that's not being discussed here is that this trial never had a chance of being fair to begin with, regardless of what way you look at it. With social media and with the mainstream media and with everything that's happening in this country related to protests at every single trial, and with the incendiary aspect of what's happening out there, and with jurors and the average citizen knowing that the decisions they're going to make have the implications of possibly causing riots and looting in their town, cases are never going to be decided the same way again. We are entering a different phase of justice. It's becoming mob justice very quick. And our jurors are instructed to not involve themselves with social media or the news or listen to other opinions. But it's becoming impossible when inside of the courthouses you can hear the protests from outside, chanting what they're chanting and sending the messages they're sending in order to reach the jurors and reach those who are involved, regardless of whether or not they want to hear the message. This is where we are now. And we all know that we're all very aware of what's going on. If we were selected for a jury at this point in time, we would still know that the possibility of unrest or of violence or threats against you and your family exist. And that's why that Sixth Amendment is no longer going to be applicable moving into the future. And that should concern you, because a right to a fair trial has always been a huge cornerstone on how the justice system of this country was built, okay? We've moved from people versus the establishment to people versus people. And if this case creates unrest, no matter what the outcome is, if unrest occurs because of it, we are no longer seeing the difference of opinion based on the people versus the police, the people versus the government, the people versus the authority. We have moved into the people versus the people. Someone's right to self-defense and somebody else's supposed right to self-defense, right? That's what this whole conversation was about. Somebody did something, other people tried to do something, and everybody was worried about saving their own life, right? That's no longer a conversation related to police brutality. That's no longer a conversation related to overarching authority. That's no longer a conversation related to what happens to people when they're on the street interacting with police or people who have the ability to enforce their will upon you. This is now citizen versus citizen. And this is why this should concern you, because it's changing the landscape of what we've been dealing with over the last year and a half. It's no longer about the police. It's no longer about racial inequality or injustice or any of those things. This case, if it leads to unrest and it leads to this mob justice mentality we've been seeing now for a very long time, well, things just don't go back to the way they were after that. And you have to understand that your individual right to a fair trial is no longer guaranteed at all. So, I want you to keep these things in mind, because yes, self-defense is always going to be important. Self-defense is something that people are going to practice no matter what a jury might decide later on, because in that moment, people are going to save their own life regardless of what the law says. But afterward, your right to a fair trial in regards to that use of self-defense is what really matters. And that is what isn't going to exist any longer. So I wanted to bring this to your attention, and hopefully this gave you some things to think about, because we've definitely moved into this new era. And now that people feel threatened in their communities, they feel threatened in their businesses, they feel threatened in general if they act one way or the other, regardless of which side of the argument you're on. All of us are now in much greater danger. And let's be honest, the people who are in power, this is what they've always wanted. The people versus the people is the best way to do things. When it's the people versus the establishment, it's a lot of problems, there's a lot of obstacles, things get a little bit more complicated. But when it's us fighting each other, well, that's just a lot easier to deal with. So keep in mind, we've already gone there now. And we'll see how this case ends. But either way, people aren't going to be happy. And if unrest ensues because of the way this case is handled, well, your Sixth Amendment's starting to look a little bit weak now, isn't it? So, wanted to bring this to your attention. We have to prepare for these things, and we have to talk about them. Brace for chaos, especially if you're in that area. And if you ever have an incendiary or politically motivated trial in your area, understand that this is the new MO, and this is probably what you're going to be faced with afterward. And without anything else to say about it, that's going to be it for Magic Prep.